Daria, thank you for coming on the podcast. I am so excited to have you. First question, how are you? How are you doing
I'm
today?
great. Thank you. I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm okay. I'm tired today. You look fabulous, by the way.
Thank you.
For
Well,
those of you who are watching, your makeup, I mean, I guess you have to because your background you need to represent, but your makeup is flawless. And I'm like, I should have concealed some more
oh my
today.
God. Thank
I'm in
you.
the camera like this.
Well, for fun fact, I will say I think my love of it, and we'll probably talk about this to some degree, made my work attractive. Like I think I was drawn to the industries that I went into based on those natural interests. But the other fun fact is that I legit just like touched up before we got on. So
I love it. I love it. I'm like flawless,
thank
flawless, flawless. You
you.
look great. So, and to that point, you've had just diving into the conversation, you've had a very, I love interviewing women who have these big lives, right? And who've had these multi passions, right? I love a zigzagger. That's what I call it. It's people who zig and zag. It's like I did this one thing and then I did this other thing over here. And you have had such a big, broad life from navigating from like beginnings, which, have some trauma elements in that, navigating, your mother's addiction to, then we're going to zag to like excelling in the corporate spaces and then, this journey that you've had to really healing trauma, healing yourself. And so my question for you is like you've had this big career, which we definitely want to hear a little bit about what you've done. And we talked about when we introed you, but I want to know when you realized, okay, it's not just enough to be successful. Like that isn't the goal anymore. That's not satisfying me anymore. When did you realize that? And what was your journey to realizing that?
So it is a journey, right? I think that we have these revelatory moments along the way. I think the first peak of it, maybe that I got was in my late 20s, which, ironically, I was just graduating from business school. I was starting my beauty career at L'Oreal. I was, in New York City and very much sort of like pedal down to on my career. But I think it was through my therapy that I had started when I was in my mid 20s that I started to just ask the question of who am I beyond my resume? Who am I outside of the things that I've achieved and done? And so while I would say that I hadn't fully grasped yet, and I will come to, I think, when I really got there, I hadn't fully grasped yet that it was that life and joy and existence, and peace and freedom, all of that comes beyond what I call performative success, right? Which is success that other people can identify and that has some other kind of external measurability or metric attached to it. So that was an instinct, more of the question that I could at least ask myself: Who am I outside of these things? And the truth is, I didn't really have an answer. And it took a while to be able to answer that question. And I think as I began to move from a place of constant self improvement and constant self development, I could start to just be in a space of self examination. And I think that shift probably started in my mid 30s, and it continues in many ways. It's still a journey in a lot of ways. But I think in my mid 30s, and definitely by the time I had turned 40 a number of years ago, I was very clear that those were just plot points. The things that I had done, the things that I had achieved, degrees that I had accumulated, whatever it was, those were just plot points in this bigger narrative. And ultimately, I think wanting to be in love with my life was at the center of my decision to redefine what success meant. But it started at 35, and so that was 9 years ago. I feel really lucky that I was younger when I could begin to come into that. And I think continuing to just check in with myself on, is this still true? Is this still right? What do I mean by success now? I think all of it is iterative. And so whatever kind of goal setting you're doing should always be rooted in where you are now and what you're hoping to cultivate in this next phase of your life. And so, yeah, I think it's definitely taken some time, but that's how I would kind of frame that journey.
It's very relatable. I think that's the other piece. Is so many of us are, my favorite phrase that I'm using now is like Black women are often mistaking ambition for condition. Like we're
Mm,
conditioned to do this. Like I got the degree, I got the good job. These checklists that are like culturally quietly in the background that
yes.
we call we're very ambitious, but it's
Yeah.
really like we're just really well conditioned to keep working past the point of what is healthy and what is actually bringing joy. It's like actually we just now get paid, but it really goes back to slavery and the diaspora where it's like just work, work, work. Like good for you. Like really unrealistic ideas that we now packaged as ambition. And so that kind of like you said, that performative, what I can grab onto. Oh wow, you work for this company. Oh wow, you made this much money. You're amazing. And that being hollow, so that was really relatable. That was point one that there were so many points, but that was point one that I thought was so relatable. But the one thing that I really love that you said, you said a lot of great things, but I think one of the things that's so novel that people don't talk enough about is you said when I shifted from self improvement to self examination.
Mhm.
And I also feel like part of the ambition conditioning trap is that Black women are just out here taking a yoga class, going to therapy, doing another like self-improvement thing, reading 4 books. And in that like we're always going, you actually don't pause to self-examine. And so I this was not a planned question for you, but I really want to dive a little bit into what do you mean by that gap between when you stopped self improving and started self examining?
Yeah, I mean, gosh, you said so much. And I think picking up on ambition, I talk about it a lot as alignment over ambition. And so I think we definitely are sharing language in that idea. But there is something, I mean, culturally, I think that, and when I say culturally, I mean being in the culture of Black women and Black people, because I see this across the diaspora, this need to improve and to show other people that you've done something, right? That you've made something of yourself. And so I think for me, this self development kind of falls in that same category of the goal setting. And then when I do this, this happens. And when I do that, that happens. And I'm going to, even reading, right? You talked about reading 4 books. I will tell you, I, good for you if you have reading goals. I do not set reading goals. Number one, I read all the time, but I don't set reading goals. Like I don't have X number of books I want to read in a year because why? Why would I put a goal like that against something that brings me joy, that is restorative, that is expansive? Like, just read, you know? I think that we are so caught up in trying to track how we're doing as if that's not going to tell you how you're doing. That's going to tell you what you did, but it's not going to tell you how you're doing. Your body is going to tell you how you're doing. Your spirit is going to tell you how you're doing. The quality of your relationships will tell you how you're doing. Your inner voice will tell you how you're doing. And so I think that we've got to just be really careful and mindful of how we think about self development because we do often put it in the camp of the same kind of goals. Now, it feels different and we call it self care, we call it whatever we want, but I don't see them as inherently different because ultimately there's this productivity aspect of it that's being attached to it. And I think that self-examination is kind. I think that it is tender, it is curious, it's not judgmental, you know, it's a step towards compassion. And if you can just examine what's there, you just become aware of it and become conscious of it, and you don't have to do anything about it, right? It's just making space. And I think allowing ourselves to just be witnesses of ourselves and of our own lives and come closer to our inner, you know, our inner person, our inner self, our soul, whatever you want to call it. I think having a deeper relationship with it, it just, I think, gives way to so much more richness and fullness, juiciness in life. I think, you know, life is so much more delicious when we can observe ourselves in it and not not sort of get swallowed up by needing to do something about it all the time. And I know we'll talk about that in the context of healing as well, but and there are steps that sometimes we have to take, but sometimes it's just information, and like let that be enough sometimes.
And absorbing it. One,
Just
I feel called off because I have a reading goal this year, but I respect it. I respect it. My little thing is I've made myself promise that I will not force myself to finish a book. Like I have a 50-page DNF where I'm
that's
like,
fine.
I don't like this. I'm not going to
Yeah.
keep reading it. Just put the book down and get a new one. But
Yes.
I love that. I totally agree with what you're saying, 100%. And it made me think about this quote as you were talking that I wrote, like I've written on my bathroom mirrors, I've written other places, and it was this quote that's like, every once in a while in the pursuit of happiness, one should pause and just be happy.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
And it's true. What all this self-improvement, all this it's another thing. It's that you're pushing the barrier. You're raising the barrier of what's going to make you happy further and further away. And you're always in a doing instead of a being. And that moment that you're talking about of just self-examination is the pause. It's the absorbing. It's the listening and saying, how do I feel about this? What is this saying to me? Where is this feel in alignment or not in alignment with who I am? And I think that's the part that Black women, I think we're starting to unlearn. Like we're just having these conversations. We're just like, why am I doing this? Why am I in this career? Why am I doing this 5 volunteer activities? I said one thing Black people are going to do, we're going to start a 501c and we're going to do 55 things. And
Yeah.
everyone was taking 55 courses on Hillman Talk. I'm like,
Oh my
go
God.
take a nap, everyone. This is too much.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. And I think it's really important to me to not be living in response to other things all the
Yes.
time. I think that when we talk about what does it look like to be the main character in your own life or the main character in your own story, part of that is recognizing when you are actually leading yourself and you're not operating from a place of being in response to something else. If everything else is the stimuli, then like, where are you in all of this? You're just reacting.
And you can make self-care and self-improvement an excuse to not show up, to be absent. It continues to make you invisible.
It is so easy to numb out and be like, oh, well, I went for a walk and I went to Pilates and I had a green juice and, I sat for 15 minutes and I called that a meditation and like, and PS, all of those things, I actually do all of those things, right, for my well-being. And sometimes I don't, because sometimes that's also not what I need. But I think we think that having the checklist of things, it's like this we're performing wellness. It's wild to me. So I want us to just not do that. I would
Let's
love
not.
to see us find a way to be more proactive in our own care. I think that typically means slowing down and not letting ourselves be reacting to everything. And, I think to sort of close the loop on where we started, to be really clear about when you're borrowing equity from, a company, a title, a salary band, like that's all borrowed equity. You earned it, right? It's part of the compensation package, so to speak. But like, let's also be really clear that your owned identity is the most important thing that you have and that you can cultivate, because all of that, as unfortunately a lot of us have seen, particularly over the past few years, it can all be taken away
In a day, in 15 minutes.
with one email.
With one email in the middle of your day telling you to pack your stuff up. And that, as we close out this part of our conversation, that leads me to kind of my last question for you, which is, you started to answer it, which is like, if you could speak to the audience right now, particularly folks that have that imaginary checklist, that are performatively ambitious, like they're checking off all the greatness, and they're saying, I'm doing it now because I'm willing to just die a little inside in my soul now, because later it's going to be better. I'm going to get a great title. I'm going to, have the house in my, whatever that later looks like for folks. What would you tell them being on both sides of this?
Oh man, I think the first thing I'd probably say is burn the bucket list. Burn the
Yes.
I don't believe in bucket lists. Again, I care so much more about how my life feels. And as a very ambitious, very driven, very goal oriented person, I am so focused and intentional about how everything feels. I don't care how it looks. I couldn't care less. You don't have to understand. It doesn't have to make sense to you. It has to feel good. And I think, and the two very simple questions that you can ask yourself in that process is, does this fuel me or does this drain me? And that applies to people, places, experiences, companies. That's to me sort of the biggest, broadest application that I can have. And it doesn't mean that I don't think about how big my life can be, or if I had everything I wanted in my life, what would it look like and what would that feel like? I do ask myself those questions, and I challenge myself when those answers look like anything other than where I'm expanded and where I feel free. I'm really clear on what my values are and the ways in which I feel most expressed and most embodied. And so I really try to prioritize the things that do that. I think for my goal setters, what I would probably offer is, if you're going to set your goals for a year, and some people do that in January or in December, I like to actually think about it around now, because with spring starting, in astrology, this is the beginning of the year, as we sort of move towards April. But whenever you choose to do it, I think, a vision writing exercise that I really love is, rather than just listing out my goals, and I started this probably 8 years ago now, is to actually write in reflection, as if the year has already happened, what happened and how did it feel, and what changed and what evolved for me, and how did I come closer to the person that I want to be. And you often will find that it's not checking off a bunch of things off your list, when you can sort of take that view. So I would say that's one way of thinking about goal setting that is a bit of a shift. And then the other thing, honestly, would really be questions that I would have about, what would I like to know more about myself? If you imagine that you're getting to know someone for the first time and you meet somebody, what are some of the things that you'd really want to know about them to get at the core of who they are? And I would think more about that, and maybe use the next year or whatever time horizon that feels good to you to answer those questions, and think about the things, the activities, the experiences, especially the solo experiences, that would allow you to maybe answer those questions. Because I think when you start to dig deep, a lot of times people, they don't know, they can't answer some of those more, I would say, sort of soulful or heartful questions.
Yeah, and then the later never comes. I mean, if you're not in tune with who you are, the later never comes if you're not trying to figure out what you're feeling.
Absolutely. I totally missed that part of your question. I mean, that's not a thing.
Right.
And I guess I missed it in part because the more proximate you come to your own inner truth, I think the more you realize that, like, none of those things really matter. And timeline, I don't think on timelines. I think we have to sometimes, when it comes to deliverables or things that we're maybe being paid to do or we do for a living. Of course, we have to be timely with certain things, but generally speaking, I don't have a lot of time bound goals in my life. And I as I said earlier, I just want to be as in love with my life as possible. Somebody said that to me a few years ago. He said, a former colleague, he said, "Your life seems so romantic." And he was saying that after I was coming off of, or maybe I was still there, but I had spent a summer in Paris 2 years ago. And he said that to me, and I said, yeah, I mean, that's the goal, right? So, I think way more about that. Like, what does it look like to romance my life and be in love with my life, than I do about doing any one thing in a moment in time. And I think it can very quickly sort of disintegrate. That timeline can dissolve really quickly. But yeah, I mean, you have to do it now, because, what what else are you going to
There's
do?
no later.
There is no
There
later.
is no later. There
There's
is none. You're leaving yourself on the table. You're leaving pieces of yourself to
Mm,
rot away by waiting for the later. And
I love
that
that.
could be we could do a whole nother side conversation about the power of travel. I used to live in Europe, and I
Yes.
feel like I learned to romanticize my life by
Yes.
stepping outside of particularly the United States and the kind of like hyper busyness, productivity, energy. So
Yes.
for sure. That's another conversation to be continued. But I love what you're saying, and I love the particular part. If there's anything to take from this, is there is no later. So do the self-examination now. There is no later. Do not wait. Do it now. And if you are struggling to do that, because sometimes in self-examination we uncover some trauma, we uncover hardship, we uncover things that we have to work through that are more than just saying, oh yes, I'm gonna be okay. You have to do more work. And one of the things I love about you is that you have this varied career, but you also have this deep love of neuroscience and post-traumatic growth. And that's where I want to move us next. It's like we've already established there is no later. So we got to do the work. And sometimes when we're doing the work, we uncover guilt, we uncover dysregulation, we uncover trauma. And so I want when we come back, I want to talk about how do we handle that? How do we move through that? More to come with Daria, Daria Burke as we dig into post traumatic growth and how to get past the living for the now and how to do that healthily. All right, we are back. This conversation is so good. I'm very excited. And we just finished talking about the need to let go of the later. It's just now. And so, and to start doing some self examination. You really got us motivated. I'm ready. I'm almost going to give up my book goals for the year. Not quite. Sorry. Sorry, Daria. Not quite. But but I am moving in that direction. And part of what I want to talk about now is oftentimes when we start self examination, things come up,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's like the reason why we're not pausing is a lot of times we don't want to hear what is going to come up initially when we do the pause, right? Where we're struggling. And so I want to talk a little bit about post traumatic growth syndrome because so many of us we may not have PTSD. I want to be clear. We may not have post traumatic stress syndrome or a disorder where it's like pathology. You need to maybe do medication or specific therapy. But so many Black women have post traumatic stress
Yes.
and they have lots of opportunities for post traumatic growth. And so, how can women, particularly your interest in this one, I want to know a little bit about what brought you to this interest, but really to be able to help Black women recognize when they are growing rather than just stuck in that surviving, ambitious, overproducing like energy,
Yeah.
particularly when they've experienced hardship.
Yes. Well, I'll quickly start with how I got into this. Back in 2017, I listened to a podcast. It was an episode of The Guardian's one of their science podcasts. And Dr. Norman Doidge, who was a philosopher turned psychiatrist, was the guest. And he was talking about neuroplasticity. And he had written about it years prior. And so it was new to me, but I would say it was probably beginning to show up in the culture and in some conversations, maybe as early as 2013. And so my ears perked up. I'm like, what is this guy talking about? And this idea that our brains are malleable and that they're not fixed. It's not, we don't have a set of predetermined ways of being or what we know, but that it can grow and change and evolve as we, encounter new experiences, as we meet people, as we learn things, and also, therefore, as we tell ourselves different stories, as we allow ourselves to imagine other possibilities. And so that, kind of first learning that aha moment, I kind of call it, my first lesson in neuroscience, that really set me on a journey of, reading a lot more about neuroplasticity and then about epigenetics, about early childhood adversity and ACEs, so adverse childhood experiences, kind of all of that. And I would say not towards the end, because my interest is ongoing, where I end in my book, is really on post-traumatic growth. And it really kind of all the lights went on as I started to learn about all of these ideas, but with post-traumatic growth in particular, because it's not something that a lot of people are familiar with. Even now, I mean, it's been written about, it's been talked about, it's, New York Times has talked about it. There are old articles in the Atlantic, but it's still this kind of wonderful kept secret, I think, in a way that is so insightful into what life could look like after a traumatic experience, that not all of us experience PTSD, to your point, but that some of us actually on the other side of something that was meant to break us, we're broken open. And so it manifests typically in one of 5 ways. Let's see if I can remember them. There's a greater appreciation for life, just in general, kind of this newfound sense of gratitude, and perspective on what really matters, stronger relationships. And so people maybe tend to find that they're in pursuit of more meaningful connections, or they want to be more intentional about cultivating them in their lives. Personal strength, they just feel more resilient, which I think is probably the most expected. Greater spiritual growth a lot of times comes, particularly people who've maybe had like a near-death experience, studies have shown, or a loss of someone else in their lives. They find themselves, connected to something greater than themselves, or, just a deeper desire to be philosophically and spiritually connected to a sort of a value system, I would say, that they can articulate, and that means something to them. And then the last thing is just this idea of new possibilities. You're maybe more risk taking, you're more willing to try new things and explore life and what it has to offer. And so I would say that if you find yourself experiencing one and sometimes more than one of those different things, you're probably having been on the other side of a traumatic experience, you might be experiencing post-traumatic growth. And I think the thing that was the most fascinating to me about post-traumatic growth was sort of the ingredients. There were 2 things, but I'll start here, which were kind of the ingredients that were consistent with people who had reported experiencing post-traumatic growth in a lot of the research that I read. And it was that they had a supportive community around them. They knew they had a support system and could really lean on the people that were there for them. The second thing was that they found meaning in what happened. And obviously that is not always easy to do. I think, though, as meaning-making creatures, our instinct is to try to do that. And so allow yourself to do that. And then the last thing was that they found benefits of what happened. Obviously, that is the hardest by far to do. But I found that just deeply fascinating when looking at the research and really starting to think about kind of the broader applications to, how do we scale that?
How do we make that a lifestyle? And that's what I love about post-traumatic growth, is that while, thank goodness, not everyone's going to experience post-traumatic stress disorder, but everybody can experience post-traumatic growth. Once you know what the domains are, which you beautifully explained, the 5, once you know those domains, you can start to be like, yes, I do appreciate my community a little bit more. Yes, I have become a more spiritual, a more connected person to something bigger than myself, whatever that is. I do arts now, and I never used to be someone who was artistic. Now it's like, I can't wait to paint, or I can't wait to dance. Like, you start to be able to see those markers. And culturally, we are a culture that has experienced huge amounts of PTSD. Mm-hmm. So post-traumatic stress, tons of that. But we also, within the culture, can see the post-traumatic growth. And so it's really amazing to be able to extract that, because in that is empowerment, in that is opportunity, and it doesn't erase it. I'm not a person who thinks that you have to experience bad things to become a good person. Like, no, you don't. You could just have had a good life. Okay. But some of us didn't have that, right? A lot of people don't have that for whatever reason. And so, but there's still opportunity for you to make meaning and to have joy and to have all these things in your life despite those circumstances. And so for folks that are struggling with this, maybe this is the first time they're hearing about post-traumatic growth, or they feel guilty because it feels like, well, if I'm busy making meaning and I'm self-examining, what about this person over here, or this thing I promised I was going to do? Rest is a luxury. All those kinds of thoughts that people get that stop them from pursuing post traumatic growth. What would you say to them? How would you encourage them?
I would say two things. I think the first is, and you hinted at this, our capacity to experience it is not only is it vast, but that the other thing that really blew me away in the research was who was most likely to experience PTG. And it was women, it was people of color or, non-white people, and it was people from impoverished backgrounds, right? Communities that over generations have had to find and be, allow themselves to be forged and made, but to find a way forward, to make a way out of no way, right? As the folks would say back in the day. And so I think be encouraged by that even if you may not be actively working to cultivate it, that I especially when I think about epigenetics, because we talk a lot about it through the lens of generational trauma, and so I guess I want people to think about it this way: if it's true, if it's possible that through the field of epigenetics we can understand and see how someone might inherit the trauma from the lines in their family, you can also inherit their wisdom and their capacity for healing and their capacity for imagination and possibility. And so that would be the one thing. That would be one thing. And I think the other thing would probably be more of a warning, which is that Black women in particular are the most most diagnosed for autoimmune diseases, right? Which are all brought on by chronic stress. And I know that, and I'm careful when I talk about this because I have very close friends who suffer from autoimmune diseases, several, and these are, young, or as I call it, young adjacent women who were diagnosed in their 20s, 30s, sometimes even, earlier. And we are the most inclined, we are the most diagnosed, and we have to find a way. We don't have the luxury, we think that that the luxury is in taking the time, but you don't have the luxury of not taking the time, because we continue to be, for any condition where women are the highest diagnosed, Black women are at the top of that list. So if it's heart disease, we're at the top. If it's autoimmune disease, we're at the top. And you think about the long tail of a lot of these autoimmune issues that manifest, yes, in, physical sort of chronic pain or lupus or respiratory issues, rheumatoid arthritis. I mean, there are so many, right? There are dozens of them. But it's also the number one indicator of cognitive decline. And so we also then become the most likely to experience, forms of Alzheimer's and dementia later in life as a result of that. So, you make the time is really what that warning is meant to say. It's not a luxury to give yourself 10 minutes to sort of scribble out your thoughts, or to find a weekly session with a therapist, or, whatever your way of dealing with whatever it is that you need to heal from and work on.
And it is that simple. It is finding the 10 minutes, because stress is cumulative, and so is the things that fight stress and combat stress. Post traumatic growth is cumulative. Like you do the little bit of work, and it also adds up, and it creates the impacts. Just like you can have negative impacts, and that's the thing. It's like I also love talking about epigenetics, and we as Black women there's a lot of conversation about all the negative things that have been inherited and can be studied. Like it is studied when it comes to endometriosis, PCOS, lupus, rheumatoid arthritis. All of these things are disproportionately found in women of color, particularly any kind of dysfunction with ovaries and reproductive organs. It is disproportionately Black women who deal with that. And there is a line between trauma and that impact. But at the same time, what isn't talked about enough is you talked about inheriting possibility and the things curiosity and creativity is that we as Black folks, this is one of the ethoses of the podcast, is that our birthright is joy. And it is this community. It's like we've also inherited that. And while we need to pay attention, very critical attention to those other factors, we can counteract them and we can combat them by understanding what else we inherited and spend more time tending to that garden than waiting to get, more, and getting endometriosis or waiting to get these kinds of illnesses. It's like, no, we could actually take 10 minutes, go to a therapy session and counter and be able to practically and realistically counter those impacts. And I don't think people talk enough about the link and that it's actually you can mitigate these impacts.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And please do, folks. So if there's anything to take from that, please do.
Yes.
Prioritize post-traumatic growth because it's the way through. And it's not just the way through, it's like actually a joyful way through. Spending your time thinking about community and thinking about things that bring joy and meaning to my life and seeing possibilities in the world, isn't it a far better way to kind of explore your health and healing than to be thinking about trauma all day long or illness all day long? I mean, it's joyful work.
Yeah, I think that, look, it would be disingenuous to say that we don't have a lot of environmental reminders.
Of course.
And active sort of agents, right, of chaos and of harm. And so, yes, I think we have to decide what's ours to carry. And what is ours to really reckon with. And I think knowing the difference between being aware of and to some degree tending to whatever the wound is, right, in your life, and being consumed by it and being, sitting in it. And I think we have to just continue to do a better job of like knowing the difference between those two things. And yeah, I mean, it's easier said than done, but it's absolutely possible. And it's absolutely ours to claim.
Yes, it's worthy work and it's where we should be claiming and going. And to that point, I want to close out our conversation when we come back and talk about joy and nourishing yourself and how to self-nourish because there are these stressors and there are things going on in the world. And yet, we can hold both in the same time. What can we do for joy? And so I want to hear from you about what brings you joy and how you've learned to nourish yourself and take care of yourself. So more to come with Daria Burke as we jump into joy, which is always my favorite part of the conversation. This conversation has flown by, Daria. This has been so good. And I always like to close the same way with everyone is about joy. But on the way to joy, it's this process of learning to nourish yourself. And to be honest, culturally, women are not taught to nourish themselves. The culture doesn't nourish you sometimes. The world doesn't nourish you. Sometimes your parents didn't nourish you. You've come up in different circumstances. And so I want to first ask, how did you learn the tools to kind of take care of yourself and rewrite the narrative of self-nourishment, of taking care of yourself?
Gosh, I love this question. I think whether it's a parental wound or a cultural wound or that you came by it another way, I've learned to listen to where I feel the most pained. It sounds odd to say that in the context of joy, but it's allowed me to be more attentive and more tender and more compassionate for those areas. And so I think wherever you find yourself feeling the most lack, the most fear or the most hardship, the most despair, it's an invitation, I think, to look at that and to think about how you can show up for it. In my case, I think I had to, and this, I got there for sure in my 30s, but maybe a little sooner in some ways, of just realizing that all I can do is the unfinished business of raising myself, wherever my parents left off. And, in some of our cases, we were very young. And in my case, I generally think that I was probably about 7 years old, at least my earliest memories of that. And so that's where I tend to go and think about what does it look like to care for myself at that age. And obviously, that's on a continuum, but I think being aware of and allowing that to inform how you show up for yourself, there's so much information in that. And I think what you do in response as a result is very much informed by that. At least it is for me.
Yeah, and when you address that and when you start to, it's scary at first going to the place that brings you pain. And so we spend most of our lives avoiding it. And then we realize the thing that pains us the most doesn't mean it's going to break us. And so once you've accepted that, okay, I'm not going to be broken by this exploration, it is the thing you have to get through and the other side of it is joy. And I've never met anyone who didn't say, I did self exploration. It was terrible. Like, I'm not doing that again. My life has gone downhill. Like, what I'm homeless. I am not able to live. I have no friends. I have nothing. I've never met that person. What everyone always says is, I did it. It hurt. But on the other side of that hurt, it didn't even hurt as long as I thought it was going to. But on the other side of that hurt, is joy. Like, I built the life that I want. And so if there's one call out, it's like, yeah, go to that place of pain, but no, it's not permanent. What you've experienced is more painful than what you will experience when you're going to do addressing it. And on the other side of that is joy. On the other side is like summers in Paris, apparently. On the other side is, having a life that you love. And that's worth it alone if you know. And that's why I want as many people as possible to meet people like you and so many other women like you. Is we just don't know enough women who are like, I did it. I'm fine.
Yes.
I'm here.
Yes.
I'm happy.
You can survive your emotions. Yes.
Did not take me out, acknowledging that I'm tender here. If we meet more people like this, there's more room for the other parts. And the other parts come quickly. It's not as long as you think it's going to be. I've had like one session with my therapist and I've been like, oh, I feel so much better and more joy is coming to me. It didn't fix all my problems, but like one session, 1 hour alleviated like months of anxiety. And it's like, this is what I want people to get. And so my last question for you, because you're on the journey, but you have done your work, is now today, what brings you joy and how do you protect the things that bring you joy?
Yeah, gosh, there's so much I want to say on the heels of what you just said. And if I may quickly, I think, yes, if you can choose to walk head first into healing, like, what if you could choose it? What if you could be proactive and not be sort of dragged by your hair, into it? What might happen? And if you can see that as an ongoing process, what you find and what I have found is not that it becomes the focal point, but that my capacity to have room for all of it grows. And so I can feel sad feelings or, come in contact with a really tender spot, and be in a place of celebration and be in a place of joy. And so, I think allowing that container to expand by naming things and, the more you make room for the things that are of you, the more room you have. And so I think with that, I find joy in everything, in so many things. In fact, I've had a few people kind of remark at how naturally exuberant I am. I can kind of get excited about almost anything. And so right now I'm out in the country. I bought a little beach house, 7 years ago now. And so I'm with wildlife a lot. And so I kid you not, like, there could be at 11 a.m., there could be deer. At 2 p.m., there might be a gaggle of turkeys. I'm always seeing, birds and squirrels and chipmunks and turtles when it gets warmer. And I find so much joy in just even seeing that. And it sounds so silly, but I think my goal in life, and I don't know that happiness is the goal, I wouldn't necessarily call that. I think appreciation and contentment And those joyful moments are what allow me to have that, you know, to feel enchanted by life and to be, I think, constantly in awe of what's happening and what's possible. And I think the perspective that, because I've been able and willing to look at kind of the totality of my life, even the things that I thought would break me, even the things where I felt like I drowned a little, even the parts of myself that I couldn't bring in this phase because they were too fragile for this new beginning. I'm so grateful for all of that. You know, I can't even imagine a different life. I can't imagine a different version of my story without all of that. And so I'm just so grateful all the time. And so it could be something as simple as staring out the window and looking at animals, kid you not, you know, and I'm lucky from here I can walk to the beach. So even in winter I do that, and it's really wonderful. And I highly suggest anybody, whatever your nearest body of water is, to just go stare at it with whatever time you have. Today I had a very long extended solo dance party. That was probably before this conversation, probably my most joyful, at least it was my joyful part of my morning, was just having a solo dance party. And for me, it doesn't take much, honestly. A beautiful poem, a good book, time with friends. You know, it's really the simple things. I think when you can really find joy in those things, everything else becomes like, you know, holy cow. You know, then my mind can be blown all the time, and I really love that.
Yeah, I love that you're in a state of awe, and that's a beautiful place to be. I love that. That it's great, and I think people are gonna feel that through. If you're listening, you can hear it in your voice. If you're watching, you can see it on your face. That it's not like you're not just giving a line. It's very much who you are, and that's hard won, but worthy work to get there. And so Daria Burke, thank you for coming on this podcast and having such a fantastic conversation. How can we contact with you and connect? And know that everything you say will be in the show notes, but I want to give you a chance to tell folks how to connect with you.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Well, thank you so much. This has been a joy for sure. And people can find me at dariaburke.com or on Instagram at Daria Burke. I'm pretty much everywhere at Daria Burke. I'm probably the most active there. And then I do have a LinkedIn newsletter as well called The Power of Possibility. So any one of those places, I would love to see you all.
They'll all be in the show notes with links to be able to check out more from you. Thank you for coming on the Black Girl Burnout podcast. It was wonderful to connect with you.
Thank you so much.